One Barracuda distracts, the other strikes. The Ukrainian military demonstrated a mission involving 2 Barracuda unmanned surface vessels, equipped with FPV drones, targeting Russian positions on the left bank of the Kherson region. One of them was stopped by the enemy, who used more resources in the process than the cost of the boat itself: 3 Lancets, 2 Molnias, and nearly a dozen FPV drones. At the same time, the other Ukrainian Barracuda reached an area where the Russian occupiers did not expect its appearance and struck the designated targets. And the border guards of the Apex Unmanned Systems Unit in the South Slobodansky direction destroyed a 152mm Gyatsint B howitzer. The Russians used the artillery piece for fire support of their units and tried to hide it using camouflage, but Ukrainian drones detected and struck it anyway. In the Kupiansk direction, Ukrainian paratroopers destroyed more than 50 antennas and enemy UAV base points. As a result of precise combat operations, 87 Russian occupiers were eliminated, 2 UAV shelters were destroyed, and 67 Molnia-type strike drones were burned. Also, the Russian communication network came under the fire control of the Ukrainian military. 56 antennas and 7 generators were hit.
The Russian occupiers' current task is to infiltrate in the smallest possible groups across the entire width of the front, thereby stretching the front line and pulling our forces as far as possible from the main directions of the Russian strikes. And this is the Donbas, this is the south of Ukraine. Accordingly, the city of Vovchansk is burning, and Kupiansk is burning as well. They are lighting matches, essentially setting torches of intense combat operations here and there across the front lines, specifically in the Kharkiv direction and also in the Sumy direction and so on, creating a widespread and devastating situation that continues to escalate rapidly.
The defense forces continue to eliminate enemy personnel in the Toretsk area, striking enemy logistics and equipment. In particular, pilots of the Phoenix border unit continue to methodically destroy the Russian occupiers. A real robot war has unfolded in the sector of the front entrusted to them. FPV drones are hunting Russian ground-based robotic systems and enemy FPV drones. A war of technology, drones destroying drones. Meanwhile, in the Sloviansk direction, the Ukrainian military repelled attempts by Russian troops to advance in the areas of the settlements of Sakotne, Kriva Luka, Rezdyakivka, Rayolexandrivka, and Mykolaivka. In the Kostiantynivka sector, the Russian army also attacked in the areas of Ilinivka, Ivanopilya, Novoselivka, Stepanivka, Sofiivka, Rusinoyar, and Vilna. And in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians tried to advance towards the settlements of Udakhne, Belitska, Serhivka, Mirne, Shevchenko, Molodetske, Kotline, and Novyi Donbas.
The Ukrainian defense forces are gradually but surely seizing the tactical initiative in certain sectors of the front. It should be noted that from January to July, about 750 square kilometers were deoccupied in the Oleksandrivka direction, and 26 previously occupied settlements were completely brought under control. And the Dnipropetrovsk region has been practically cleared of the presence of occupation forces. We are talking about the fact that the occupiers maintain a presence in the settlement of Dakhny. But the main thing that should be said is that the successful advance of the Ukrainian defense forces in the Dnipropetrovsk region primarily disrupted the Kremlin's political plans.
In the Zaporizhzhia direction, pilots of the Ronin Unmanned Systems Battalion continue to fight daily for the Ukrainian sky, detecting and striking enemy targets. The Russian military strikes at everything, so every downed Russian Molnia UAV for the defense forces is someone's saved life and a struck target of the invaders. The pilots of the Hornets of Davbush Battalion added a rare trophy to their list of destroyed targets. A Russian Zemledeliye remote mining engineering system was detected and destroyed. The invaders used this system for rapid and large-scale mining of territories, creating problems for the defense forces. But the Ukrainian birds worked precisely and filigree. As a result, the expensive equipment of the Russian army burned down. A series of precise strikes from HIMARS MLRS were carried out by warriors of the 147th Separate Artillery Brigade of the 7th Rapid Reaction Corps of the Air Assault Forces in coordination with intelligence and unmanned systems units. As a result, 7 Russian howitzers, a D-30 cannon, 3 ammunition storage sites, and an area of personnel concentration were destroyed and damaged, and 7 Russian occupiers were eliminated, with another 7 wounded. and over the past 24 hours, the Ukrainian defense forces have eliminated 1,190 Russian occupiers. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has already lost 1,471,000 troops. Also, the day before, Ukrainian defenders destroyed 2 Russian tanks, 50 artillery systems, and 3 multiple launch rocket systems. In addition, nearly 24 UAVs and 428 units of enemy automotive and special equipment were destroyed.
Sergei Muratovich, let's also talk in more detail about the situation on the front, specifically along the contact line, because the Russians are trying to advance in 3 sectors, the Kostiantynivka, Pokrovsk, and Sloviansk directions. There, in principle, if you even look at the map published by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, there are simply straight stretches of roads that the defense forces are heroically repelling, even despite the fact that the Russians have more personnel. According to the latest data,
if we talk about the losses that were also announced by the leadership, the military leadership of the country, it is 1 to 6, 1 to 8, where 1 life of a Ukrainian defender is lost for every 6 or 8 Russian occupiers. Is it possible to calculate the strategic goal behind such active actions of the Russian occupiers on this particular section of the front?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And you have just named those 3 sections of the front line that are of the greatest interest to Russia and force Russia to concentrate the largest number of troops there. According to some data in that sector, which we call the Donetsk direction or the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk direction in a broader sense, the enemy has concentrated forces and means of troops, weapons, and equipment approximately as much as they started this war within February of 2022. In other words, this grouping is desperately trying to advance towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And that is precisely why you pointed out that the enemy is moving, is trying to advance in these very directions, in these sectors, on the Pokrovsk, on the Kostiantynivka, and to the east of Sloviansk, exerting such desperate pressure, well, generally speaking, with minimal success. There is success, it must be admitted. There is success because the superiority in forces and resources is great, but Ukrainian troops continue to put up desperate resistance, destroying the enemy. How long this pace will last is very difficult to say because statistics are relentless. The enemy increased the intensity of combat operations based on the results of July to 8,000 combat engagements per month. That is more than 200 engagements per day. At the same time, they achieved minimal advancement. How long their resources will last is difficult to say. They are already paying a very high price for this, having practically abandoned active combat operations on the southern sector of the front, where, compared to the Donetsk direction and the Kharkiv direction, the number of combat engagements is minimal. But it is precisely this point, precisely this sector that you are talking about, that is the most important sector in the battle for Ukraine today.
Sergei Muratovich, I would also like to talk to you in this vein about how, in your opinion, the task of replenishing the Russian army's manpower will be solved in order to try to somehow implement the plans that the occupier is harboring within the framework of the so-called future mobilization, and also taking into account the position voiced by the representative, the deputy head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Vadim Skibitsky, that Russia will try to create certain conditions, or at least look in that direction, to theoretically or practically, we don't know how this might happen, try to start some new offensives in the north of our country?
Well, let's start from the end. I am very critical of this statement that the Russian Federation might try to do something in other sectors of the front, because even today in the sectors we are talking about, the intensity of combat operations varies. That is, we have just discussed that the enemy is forced to concentrate all their efforts on one sector. And as they say in Ukraine, if only our calf could eat that much, meaning it's easier said than done, wishful thinking. Therefore, preparing an offensive in other sectors, particularly in the Chernihiv direction, would require a colossal strain of resources and is unlikely to be carried out in the near future. Well, just so it's clear, the enemy spent 10 months concentrating an invasion force of 180,000 people. If we are talking about the middle and already the second half of August, it's hardly worth saying that they will be able to open new sections of the front somewhere in February. Plus here, we need to take into account the specifics of the terrain, the relief, and the geography. So I suggest leaving the northern direction alone for now and focusing on what might actually happen. And what might happen is the following. We have been talking for a very long time and a lot about mobilization. Of course, it is not exactly ruled out the enemy might do something. But you understand that the Russian leadership will do everything to minimize the negative effect of this mobilization. Let's note that already today at the borders, there is a sharp increase in the number of people trying to leave the Russian Federation. Does this mean that there will be no people left? No. And here, a particular cause for concern is the fact that Russians, and by the way, look at these young faces now, Russians are making widespread use of the population in the occupied territories, conducting psychological indoctrination of the youth, including them in the regime of so-called involvement in the UNARMIA format. And just so the numbers are clear, at least up to 4 million young people are involved in this format. Imagine if just 10% of these people were to be involved in the mobilization process or in signing a contract. We are talking about 400,000. Therefore, it is necessary to understand that by committing this crime, and it is a crime since involving residents of occupied territories in the active army is a crime, the Russians can avoid what is called a broad mobilization. Therefore, we are monitoring this situation and its development very closely. And we understand that we must be prepared for the fact that the Russian army has and will continue to have the resources to increase the number of personnel in certain sectors of the front. This means we need to counter this, so to speak. You understand yourself, the most terrible thing is that residents of our occupied territories may be involved in these battles. And in fact, this allows the Russians to, as it were, reduce the pressure on what is called the recognized territory of the Russian Federation. Once again, I say mobilization as such does not necessarily have to be connected with catching people on the streets. The Russians can use other more monstrous, I would say, sophisticated methods of building up their combat formations.
Sergei Maratovich,